Hello and welcome to the World History Addicts podcast. I am Devon, and today I'll be talking about the different worlds that make up the global order. The first world, the second world, and the third world, maybe even the fourth world. We'll analyze what makes different countries fit into each category, the historical context of where these terms came from in the first place, some interesting cases in each of the categories, and the future of this world system. Let's begin. So why do we use terms like first world and third world? Well, the classification of these different countries into different worlds is, by and large, a product of the post-World War II global situation during the Cold War. The Axis powers had been defeated, but one conflict led into another, because the Western allies, who had previously been allied with the Soviet Union, started fighting against them, not directly, because this was now the nuclear age, and it was no longer feasible. And even before the Soviets had their nuclear weapons, they had so many troops massed on the borders of Western Europe that they could have invaded, and they would have done an insane amount of damage had they done that. It would have cost everyone much more than anyone at the time was willing to pay. So they decided that instead of fighting directly, it was better to fight indirectly through covert operations, espionage, sabotage, funding revolutions in each other's territories or spheres of influence. And it was in 1952 that a French writer named Alfred Salvi compared the new classes of the nations to the three estates of pre-revolutionary France, that being the first estate, which was the clergy and the church officials, the second estate being the king and the nobles, and the third estate are the commoners, the peasants, the poor, and the working class. The first world was the Western allies and those who fought with them against the Soviet Union and the other socialist states who opposed the West. There were Soviet-aligned states in the Second World, and that term isn't used very much anymore because the Soviet Union no longer exists, and the bloc of countries that used to be part of the Soviet bloc are also more aligned with the Western world. So Second World is still used, but in a different way today. And there are also many different post-colonial nations, as during the post-World War II era, many different countries in Africa especially were getting their own independent countries from the British Empire or other European empires. But many of them chose not to be aligned, or they were heavily divided between whether they were pro-American and pro-West or pro-Soviet and pro-socialism. So they became the Third World. That was the non-aligned movement. And as I said a bit before, the terms First World and Third World weren't entirely about economic level or wealth levels. Switzerland was considered a Third World country for the Cold War because it's a neutral country, so it didn't ally with either the Western capitalists or with the Soviet-aligned nations. And it wasn't the only one in Europe. There's also Ireland, though the Irish were a bit poorer back then, so I think Third World may have made more sense back then. Austria, Finland, and Sweden also chose to stay neutral. They didn't really side with either camp, so they were part of the larger non-aligned movement. Yugoslavia was interestingly part of the Third World, despite being a socialist republic, because the leader, Josip Broz Tito, didn't care much about what the West or the Soviet East had to say, and he went his own way instead. Strangely, Turkey and Iran were actually considered First World, because up until the 1970s, Iran was under the Shah, and they were friends with the West. They were actually trying to rapidly modernize and westernize Iran, but that also just led to Islamists taking over in 1979. Also, for the Philippines, Oman, the United Arab Emirates, and South Africa were also on the pro-Western side, so they were considered First World. And Angola, Mozambique, the Western Sahara, and French Guiana, which today is actually still part of France, it's considered an overseas province of France, were also considered First World because they were colonies of countries that were inside the First World. But by the end of the Cold War in 1991, the ideological struggle between the capitalists and the communists was much less important. The main conflict after the 90s was really the war on terror. And arguably today we have a second Cold War against China for reasons that are less about economic ideology and more about trade relations and nationalistic disputes over territory like in the South China Sea. So instead of it being about ideological alignments, terms like First World and Third World are more about wealth and development, and I think to some degree about democracy. first world countries are democratic and rich. Third world countries are poor and dictatorships or have a very corrupt democracy. And second world is somewhere in between. They're not rich enough to be first world, but they're too developed to be third world. So then, who are the different first, second, and third world countries? The first world, off the bat, has largely remained unchanged outside of a few weird outliers like Iran or the African nations that were colonies. The U.S. is part of the first world. It is arguably the head of the first world. There's Canada, Australia, the Western European and Northern European countries. There's New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. There's a few Central European countries, I think like Slovenia and Poland, that have basically become first world after their leaving the Soviet bloc. And you got Uruguay and a few other wealthy states like Israel and the Gulf Arab countries, but we'll come back to those later because they're an interesting case. The second world is pretty much the former Soviet bloc. You got countries that were formerly part of the Soviet Union. The Russians are they're the main drivers of the Soviet Union, but you also have Belarus, Romania, Moldova, Hungary, former Yugoslav states, and also China, North Korea. But there are also middle power countries like Brazil or Iran, as well as India and Turkey. Some of these countries aren't especially poor and not especially unadvanced, but I think they have enough problems with corruption or stability of their democracy, which disqualifies them from being full-fledged first world countries. And to that end, the three-world model is not entirely unideological. There is still the point that if a country is just a straight-up dictatorship, I don't think it can count as a first world country. Now, the dividing line between second world and third world is a bit blurry and kind of arbitrary because it raises the question of how rich a third world country has to become or how much development they need before they can upgrade to becoming a second world. But one rule that I use is if a country that might be in the second or third world has nuclear weapons or they have a space program while still being a dictatorship or having lots of poverty, I would say that counts as a second world country. And another rule of thumb is that poor industrial nations that are either industrialized or mostly industrialized are second world, while poor countries that rely more on farming and agriculture and are mostly rural and not urbanized are third world. The third world's the widest category and encompasses a very wide array of countries, mostly in Africa and equatorial Latin American countries like El Salvador and Honduras, and also a few Middle Eastern nations like Yemen and Afghanistan, and some Pacific countries like Papua New Guinea or Kiribati. They're poor, not industrial, and I think that in many of the cases they are also under the rule of a government that's not democratic. So I think that counts as third world. But as I said before, I think there are some countries that don't easily fall into the three-world model. These countries are outliers, and they have a unique set of conditions that means they're a bit different from the rest. And I think the first category of these are odd nations that are both developed but are also unfree in a way that isn't entirely obvious. For example, the Gulf Arab states and Israel, which I brought up earlier. The state of Israel is very advanced, and it also has a democratic government that's similar to that of the United Kingdom. But the problems start to come in when you realize that many of the people who live inside of Israel don't have the same rights as the Jewish majority. They're Arabs and they're the Palestinians, especially those on the West Bank, who are often being kicked out of their own homes by settlers. And the West Bank is supposed to be part of Palestine, but it's actually being annexed illegally by Israeli settlers. But even if that wasn't the case, there's also just the sheer fact that Israel is a identitarian state. The Jewish identity covers multiple different races because there are Ashkenazi Jews who are mostly of white European descent from Europe. And you also have Mizrahi Jews who are more of Middle Eastern descent, and many of them have more Arab or Persian blood. And in fact, there are also black Jews from Ethiopia and other parts of East Africa. There are even Jews from India called the B'nai Israel or B'nai Menashe, or the Chinese Jews called the Yahudut Kaifengim. Those are the minority, but they do exist. So it's not exactly a race in the traditional sense, but it is an identity. And Israel is set up from the ground up to serve one specific identity group, which is really unlike anything else in the first world. There are some countries like Japan or Iceland where there is an ethnic supermajority, like the vast majority of people in Japan are Japanese. but they're also native to that land and they haven't left. There's never been a time, I think, where Japan hasn't been majority Japanese within, let's say, the past 1,000 years. And they weren't set from the ground up to only serve one specific group. So that's, I think, a bit different. And there's also the fact that, unfortunately, in the West, you have actual neo-Nazis who, even though they don't like Jews, will point at Israel and say, if they can have their identity state, why can't we? And I've actually seen several interviews where these neo-Nazis have brought up those arguments, and the liberal respondents, the people who are trying to answer and refute them, really weren't able to because they didn't recognize Israel for the identitarian state that it is. But just to show that I'm not picking on Israel or just the Jewish people, their neighbors in the Gulf Arab states also, I think, fall into this category, especially the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait, along with Saudi Arabia and Oman. They're pretty strange in that they're very wealthy, but most of this wealth, if not all of it, is coming from oil money, which is also outsourced to people in Western countries. They also rely very heavily on forced labor from migrant workers from South Asian countries like Pakistan and India who have their passports seized, so they're not legally allowed to leave, and they just have to keep working under this system. In the case of the UAE, these South Asian migrant quasi-slaves are actually the largest class of person. They're actually more of these migrants from South Asia than there are actual native Emiratis, which I think is insane. In Bahrain or Qatar's case, it's a bit less unbalanced, but they still do make roughly half the population. Now, this is interesting because they're basically a kind of class of quasi-industrial states because they didn't go through the modernization process of industrial development. They just outsourced all the benefits of modern industry to someone on the outside who did go through that process, and they're able to retain a kind of pre-modern society. I would compare it to either the Confederacy during the Civil War or the Kingdom of Congo. They both relied much more on exporting raw materials and using the money they got from those materials to buy industrial technology that they could use to live a kind of industrial standard of living, even though they didn't modernize their society to keep up with that. Singapore, I think, also follows this logic because it's also very well developed and it's advanced, but it's not really a democracy. Lee Kuan Yew was arguably one of the best leaders of the 20th century. He was a world-class statesman because he turned a racially divided and poor British colony because at that time, Singapore was divided between Chinese immigrants from China and there were also Indian immigrants in that area, but also native Malays. And the three groups didn't get along and were actually killing each other in the 1960s. But Lee Kuan Yew stepped in, and he created a system that respected all three groups, though with heavy emphasis on the Chinese majority. His People's Action Party is notorious because they keep using lawsuits to bankrupt anyone who challenges them. So on paper, they're democratic, but in practice, they're really not. The legal penalties are also very harsh in Singapore, probably more than any other modern first world country. Because, for one, there's a mandatory death penalty for smuggling drugs, and I think even tough-on-crime Republicans in many of the red states would actually find that extreme. There's also the fact that lawbreakers, of misdemeanors, end up getting beaten with large canes, which I don't think is the norm in any first-world country, and often not even the norm in many second-world countries. I don't even think North Korea has any comparable legal punishment of just getting beaten up with a cane for committing a misdemeanor. And back in the 1990s, in 1994, there was an American teenager in Singapore who vandalized a bunch of cars and stole some road signs, and he ended up getting sentenced to being beaten with the cane. Originally, it was 6 lashes of the cane, but the U.S. Diplomats managed to get that toned down to 4 times, which was still very painful, but if it had been more than that, he could have been permanently disabled. So for those reasons, I don't think Singapore counts as a real first world country. There's also the Vatican City, which, if we're being honest, is not really a country at all and really more of a legal fiction due to the strong support for the Pope being politically independent from the secular Italian state, which was established in the mid-1800s. And despite being nearly 2,000 years old in terms of its tradition, the current Vatican City is less than 100 years old. It's only been around since 1929 due to a deal between Pope and Benito Mussolini. There's less than 1,000 people living in Vatican City, only about 882. And it's also 95% male, which is unlike any other country in the world. You can't actually be born a citizen of Vatican City. you have to be elected by the Pope to become a citizen. It's not a poor country, and I believe it does enjoy a pretty modern standard of living because it is within the modern infrastructure of the city of Rome. But it is still an absolute monarchy, and it's a theocratic regime, just the same as the Gulf Arab states. There's also the fact that their main source of income is tourism and donations from Catholic believers from all around the world, which honestly is unlike any state I know of. Perhaps if Saudi Arabia didn't have the oil, they would rely more on that because they have the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, which is where the Hajj goes to. That's the Islamic yearly pilgrimage from all around the world to those holy cities. And I think this also shows how arbitrary countries really are. Like, nationhood is very arbitrary because the fact that an enclave, not even the full city of Rome, but an enclave, a few neighborhoods of Rome is considered a real country, but most countries don't recognize Taiwan, also known as the People's Republic of China. Even though it has millions of citizens, it's an entire island, and it has all the modern industries that a first world country needs, and probably a bit more than that. But because of pressure from Communist China or the People's Republic of China on the mainland, most countries would prefer to recognize that China instead of Taiwan. And for our last example, we have Somalia. On paper, I think it could easily be considered a third world country, and for the most part it is, but I think it doesn't really qualify even as a real country. It only recently set up a government, I believe back in 2012, but doesn't even have full control over its own claimed territory. And really, de facto, Somalia is a no man's land that's run by tribal chiefs, warlords, and even pirates who control much of the coast and raid shipping vessels that pass by. And my argument here is that in order to be a third world country, you need to be a country first, and I can't honestly say that Somalia is a real country given how it actually works. There's also some categories and some outside of the three worlds that have already been proposed, even before I pointed out these strange exceptions. Because back in the 70s, there was actually a proposed fourth world that counts people without countries, especially indigenous people or minorities who have lower standards of living, but live inside first world countries. And I think this is interesting because it describes a very diverse group of people. Like, you have the Romani minority or the Gypsies in Europe. You have Bedouin tribes inside of Israel. And you also have many different Native American nations in the United States, like the Lakota or the Hopi Nation. And you also got smaller or other types of minorities who aren't indigenous or aren't nomads, like African Americans or the Rohingya people in Myanmar who are being genocided by the military junta there. The term fourth world is very obscure and it's used very rarely, but I think it could be grouped into the class of nations I mentioned earlier that don't fit into the three worlds model, or perhaps I could include both of those categories. And while we're on the topic, there's also an alternative model called the world systems theory that categorizes countries more based on where they are in the hierarchy of imperial nations. Because like the first world, the U.S. and the EU are part of this group, and I believe certain wealthy East Asian countries are too. Japan is on the map that I looked up for it. For some reason, South Korea isn't, even though to some degree South Korea is actually a bit wealthier per capita than Japan. But for some reason, they were considered part of the periphery. The semi-periphery. The full periphery is the countries at the bottom, like most of Africa or Haiti or the Middle Eastern countries. Those are the periphery, and they're also the world systems equivalent of the third world. Semi-periphery is a bit different because they're not part of the imperial core, but they can resist them. And in China's case, they can actually create their own alternative core because as time goes on, especially with Donald Trump, China's influence is expanding to many countries that are tired of being underneath America's neo-imperial power. And there are also other countries that can produce and advocate for themselves in a way that much weaker countries can't, like, say, Russia or India, or even smaller nations that still have lots of power, like Brazil, Indonesia, and Mexico within their own region. And that leads to the question of how I would classify the world and what we can take away from all this. So personally, I would combine the world systems model with the three worlds model and the additional fourth world, but also keep my own classification of outlier countries like Vatican City and Singapore. The three worlds plus the fourth world has pretty easy terms to understand. I think first and third world have gotten into the pop culture to the point that they probably won't go away. But I do like how the world systems model emphasizes how it's not just wealth that defines what a country is, but it's also how it relates to, it's the relationship between powerful countries and weaker nations. That's also very important. We also have my view that some countries aren't really countries and are often unique enough that they deserve their own category. There are countries that pretend to be first world while having many second world traits like Israel, Qatar, or Singapore, and I think they could be part of the fifth world. There is a special category, I think, of countries that are modern on the surface, but not really modern beneath the surface. And I think what that means is that the world is much more complicated than meets the eye, and people, by any metric, are very difficult to categorize. It also shows that terms can change pretty drastically over history, because today Austria and Sweden are just first world countries, but back in the Cold War, because the definition wasn't about wealth, it was about alignment with America or Russia, they were third world countries because they just didn't want to get involved. And Iran back then was considered a first world country, but I don't think anyone would call them that today. So it's not just what countries are or what they have that defines them, it's really what they do and how they interact with other countries that matters. Wealthy countries can be called first world, and they can be held up as paragons of freedom and development and success, or they can just be framed as exploiters and bullies who intervene in other countries, and even if they don't directly steal from them, they don't just take their resources and their land, they still intervene in them, and they put pressure on them in a way that would be unacceptable the other way around. And with that in mind, every country is different, and no matter what happens, some nations will have more power than others in the global order. It's really only a question of who has it, how unequal the setup is, and what they use that power to do. Thank you for listening into the World History Addicts podcast. You can stay updated for more episodes and releases on the Instagram page at World History Addicts Podcast. Thank you again, and have a great day.